Welcome to Speak English with me.
Improve your vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation with our engaging lessons.
Emma, I think I made a serious mistake last month, and I'm still hearing about it.
That sounds dramatic. What did you do?
I recommended a movie to a friend.
That's it? You said it like you accidentally destroyed a building.
You haven't heard the whole story yet. My friend had just finished a huge project at work. He was exhausted, and he finally had one free evening. He asked me, "What's the best movie you've watched recently?" Without hesitating, I gave him a recommendation.
Let me guess, he hated it.
Not only did he hate it, but he called me the next day and said, "Sam, I trusted you."
Oh, that's painful.
It really was. And the funny thing is that I still think it's a great movie. I didn't suddenly change my opinion. I just realized that my friend and I enjoy completely different kinds of films.
I think that's where most recommendation disasters begin. We get excited about something we love, and then we forget that other people aren't copies of us.
That's true. When I recommended that movie, I wasn't thinking about his taste. I was thinking about my taste.
Which is a surprisingly common mistake, and actually, that's a perfect way to begin today's episode.
Welcome back to Speak English with me. I'm Sam.
And I'm Emma. Today we're talking about giving recommendations in English, because recommendations are part of everyday life. We recommend movies, books, restaurants, travel destinations, podcasts, and sometimes even life advice.
And if you enjoy learning English through natural conversations, don't forget to follow the podcast. We'd love to have you with us for future episodes as well.
Now, before we get into useful phrases, I want to ask you something. Have you ever received a recommendation that completely changed your life?
That's a big question.
I know.
Maybe not my entire life, but I once received a recommendation that changed one of my habits. A colleague told me to start taking a short walk every day during lunch. At first, I ignored the advice because it sounded too simple.
That's usually what happens. The best advice often sounds too simple.
A few weeks later, I finally tried it, and I was surprised by how much better I felt. More energy, less stress, and a clearer mind. That's when I realized that good recommendations don't always have to be exciting.
That's such a good point. People often think recommendations are about movies and restaurants, but sometimes the most valuable recommendations are small suggestions that improve everyday life.
Speaking of recommendations, let's look at a phrase that English speakers use all the time. I'd recommend.
That's probably one of the most useful phrases in English. For example, if someone asks about improving their listening skills, you could say, "I'd recommend listening to English every day."
Simple, natural, and polite.
Another phrase I like is, "you might enjoy."
I use that one a lot because it feels less direct. If a friend asks me about a TV series, I might say, "You might enjoy this show if you like mystery stories."
And listeners, notice the difference. When you say "you might enjoy," you're making a suggestion. You're not promising that the other person will love it.
That's important because recommendations can be risky, as my movie story clearly proves.
I still can't believe your friend called you the next day.
He was genuinely disappointed.
Did you apologize?
Not immediately.
Sam?
I tried to defend the movie first.
Of course you did.
Then I realized I was making things worse.
Much worse.
Another phrase that's useful is "you should try." This one is slightly stronger. For example, you should try reading for 10 minutes before bed, or you should try speaking English out loud every day.
And if you want to sound more personal, you can say, for example, if you enjoy historical dramas, I'd recommend this series.
That's one of my favorite recommendation patterns because it focuses on the listener, not the speaker.
Which brings us back to the lesson you learned from your movie recommendation.
Think about the other person first.
Exactly. Well, not exactly. Think about the other person before you recommend something.
Nice save.
Thank you. And we'd love to hear from our listeners. What's the best recommendation you've ever received, and why did it work so well?
Was it a person you trusted? Was it the recommendation itself? Or was it the perfect recommendation at the perfect time?
That's what we're going to explore next because some recommendations feel instantly convincing while others leave us completely unconvinced.
You know, Emma, when we were talking about recommendations a few minutes ago, it reminded me of something I've always found interesting. Two people can hear the same recommendation and react in completely different ways.
That's true, and when that happens, people often assume the recommendation failed, but I don't think that's always the case.
Really?
No, because sometimes the recommendation itself is good. The problem is that it wasn't right for that particular person. Those are two different things.
That's a great distinction. It reminds me of online reviews. Have you ever looked at reviews for a hotel or restaurant and felt completely confused?
All the time. One review says, "This place is incredible." The next review says, "Worst experience of my life." Then you're left wondering if they're talking about the same place.
I had that experience when I was planning a trip a few years ago. I spent hours reading reviews. Some people loved a certain hotel because it was quiet and peaceful. Other people hated it because they thought it was too quiet and too far from the city center.
Which proves that people want different things. That's why understanding the person is often more important than understanding the product.
That's such an interesting idea. Maybe the best recommendations aren't made by people who know a lot. Maybe they're made by people who know you well.
I think there's some truth in that. If a close friend recommends a book, I'm much more likely to listen than if a stranger recommends the same book.
Even if the stranger is an expert?
Sometimes yes.
That's fascinating.
Because a friend knows my personality, they know what I enjoy, they know what usually captures my attention and what usually doesn't. An expert might know more about books in general, but my friend knows more about me.
That actually leads us to a useful phrase. If you're giving a recommendation based on personal experience, you can say, "Personally, I'd recommend." That's a very natural expression. Imagine someone asks about learning English. You could say, "Personally, I'd recommend listening to English every day rather than studying long vocabulary lists."
I like that phrase because it sounds honest. You're sharing an opinion rather than presenting a universal truth.
That's important. People tend to trust recommendations when they sound genuine. Another phrase I hear quite often is, "From my experience."
That's one of my favorites. For example, from my experience, the best way to improve speaking is to practice a little every day.
Notice that you're supporting the recommendation with your own story.
And stories are powerful. Human beings naturally pay attention to stories.
That's probably why recommendations from friends can be so persuasive. They don't just say, "Try this." They say, "I tried this, and here's what happened."
Let me give you an example. Imagine a friend asks for travel advice. Instead of saying, "Visit this city," you could say, "I spent a week there last year and I loved it because the people were friendly and everything was easy to explore on foot."
Suddenly, the recommendation feels more believable.
Because there's a reason behind it.
That reminds me of another expression. If you're looking for...
That's a very useful one.
For example, if you're looking for a relaxing vacation, I'd recommend visiting a small coastal town.
Or if you're looking for a good, beginner-friendly book, I'd recommend this one.
I think that's one of the reasons some recommendations sound stronger than others. The strongest recommendations usually match a specific need.
That's a great observation. People rarely want random suggestions. They're usually trying to solve a problem.
That's true. Someone isn't just asking for a restaurant recommendation. They might be looking for a quiet place for a date, a cheap place for students, or somewhere suitable for a family dinner.
And the more clearly you understand what they're looking for, the better your recommendation becomes.
Have you ever ignored a recommendation and later regretted it?
Oh, definitely. Years ago, several friends kept telling me to read a particular book. For months, I ignored them. I kept saying, "Maybe someday."
Let me guess. Eventually, you read it.
I did, and then I spent the next week wondering why I had waited so long.
That's the worst feeling.
It really is, and it taught me something important. Sometimes we reject recommendations because we're not ready for them yet.
That's an interesting thought.
The recommendation might be good, the timing might simply be wrong.
I never thought about it that way.
Think about learning English. Sometimes someone recommends a podcast, a study method, or a habit. You ignore it. Then, 6 months later, you try it, and suddenly it works perfectly.
So the recommendation didn't change.
Right, you changed.
I love that idea. And maybe that's another reason recommendations are so fascinating. They sit somewhere between information and human connection.
And as we're about to discover, the language we use when recommending something can also change how people react, because some recommendation phrases sound gentle and friendly, while others sound much more confident and persuasive.
One thing I've noticed over the years is that people don't just react to the recommendation itself, they also react to the way it's presented.
That's very true. Sometimes I hear two people recommend the same restaurant, and one recommendation sounds believable while the other sounds like an advertisement.
That's a great comparison. A few months ago, a friend kept telling me about a restaurant he loved. Every time we met, he talked about it as if it were the greatest place on earth.
Let me guess, by the time you finally visited, your expectations were through the roof.
They certainly were. I walked in expecting a life-changing meal. The food was good, the service was good, and I enjoyed myself. But because he had praised it so much, I left feeling slightly disappointed.
That's one of the hidden dangers of strong recommendations. The higher the expectation, the harder it becomes to satisfy it.
Which is why native speakers often choose their recommendation phrases carefully. One expression you'll hear quite often is, "I'd highly recommend."
That's a useful phrase because it communicates enthusiasm without sounding too dramatic. For example, I'd highly recommend this book if you're interested in psychology.
Or, "I'd highly recommend visiting this city during spring." It sounds confident, but it still leaves room for personal taste.
That's an important detail. Good recommendations acknowledge that people have different preferences.
Another phrase I hear all the time is, "It's worth checking out."
I love that one because it feels relaxed and friendly. You're saying something deserves attention, but you're not putting pressure on the listener.
For example, there's a small museum near the town center that's worth checking out.
Or, if you're trying to improve your listening skills, this podcast is worth checking out.
See, that feels natural. It doesn't sound like you're trying to convince someone. You're simply sharing an idea.
And people tend to respond better when they feel free to make their own decision.
That reminds me of something. Have you ever met a person who recommends everything?
Oh, yes. Every restaurant is amazing. Every movie is brilliant. Every book is unforgettable.
After a while, those recommendations start losing their power.
Because people begin to wonder whether anything is genuinely special.
That's why softer recommendation phrases can sometimes be more effective.
One example is, "You may want to consider."
That's especially useful in professional situations.
Imagine a colleague asking for advice about a training course. You could say, "You may want to consider this course because it's very practical and beginner-friendly."
It sounds thoughtful rather than emotional.
Another phrase I use often is, "One option is."
I like that phrase because it recognizes that there may be several good answers.
For instance, if someone asks how to improve their English speaking skills, you could say, "One option is joining an online conversation group."
Notice that you're offering a possibility, not presenting the only solution.
And that often makes people more willing to listen.
Let me ask you something. When a friend asks for recommendations while visiting your city, what's the first thing you do?
I usually ask questions before giving any recommendations.
That's probably a smarter approach than mine.
I don't know about that, but I do think it helps. I want to understand what the person enjoys. Some people love history. Others care more about food, nature, shopping, or entertainment.
So your recommendation depends on the person.
Very much so. If two visitors arrive on the same day, they might receive completely different suggestions from me.
That leads to another useful expression. It depends on what you're looking for.
That's an incredibly natural phrase. Native speakers use it constantly.
For example, if someone asks, "What's the best place to stay?" you could answer, "It depends on what you're looking for."
Then you can continue by asking questions and narrowing down the options.
I think that's where many learners make a mistake. They focus so much on finding the perfect phrase, they forget to think about the conversation itself.
There's a lot of truth in that. Communication isn't only about vocabulary, it's also about understanding the person in front of you.
And when people feel understood, they usually trust your recommendations more.
That's probably why personal recommendations carry so much weight. They feel human.
Before we move on, let's review a few expressions we've used today. I'd highly recommend, it's worth checking out, you may want to consider. One option is, and it depends on what you're looking for.
Those phrases can make your recommendations sound much more natural, but there's another challenge that English learners often face. Sometimes someone suddenly asks, "What would you recommend?" and you need to respond immediately. Let's talk about how to handle those situations next.
I think this is the moment that makes many English learners nervous. You're having a normal conversation, everything is going well, and then suddenly someone asks, "What would you recommend?"
And your mind goes completely blank.
Even when you have plenty of ideas.
That's because responding in real time is very different from reading phrases in a textbook. In real conversations, you usually have just a few seconds to think.
I remember meeting a tourist while traveling a few years ago. We were chatting at a cafe, and after a few minutes, he asked me, "I've only got one day here. What would you recommend?"
That's quite a big question.
It was. My first thought was, how am I supposed to answer that? One day isn't much time, and I had no idea what kind of traveler he was.
That's why asking follow-up questions can be so helpful. Many people think they need to answer immediately, but often the best response is another question.
Such as?
What kinds of places do you enjoy? Or are you interested in history, food, nature, or culture? Those questions help you understand what the other person is looking for.
That's a great strategy because it takes some pressure off you as well.
It does, and once you have more information, your recommendations become much more useful.
Let's imagine someone says, "I'm trying to improve my English. What would you recommend?"
In that situation, I probably wouldn't give just one answer. I'd give a few options.
Why?
Because people learn differently. I might say, one option is listening to English podcasts every day. Another option is joining a conversation group. You could also try keeping a journal in English.
That's a very natural response.
And notice something important. I didn't say that one method was perfect for everyone.
That's true. You presented several possibilities and allowed the listener to decide.
Which often feels more helpful than giving one strong recommendation.
Here's another situation. Imagine a friend says, "I'm looking for a good book to read."
My first response would probably be, what kind of books do you usually enjoy?
You're very committed to asking questions first.
I am, because I've learned from experience. Years ago, I recommended one of my favorite novels to a friend. I thought she would love it.
Let me guess, she didn't.
Not even close. A week later, she told me she couldn't finish it. That was the moment I realized that my favorite book isn't automatically someone else's favorite book.
That's a lesson many of us learned the hard way.
It certainly was for me.
Another useful phrase for these situations is, "If I were you."
That's a very common recommendation phrase. For example, if I were you, I'd start with something simple and build from there.
Or, "If I were you, I'd spend a few days researching before making a decision."
It sounds personal because you're imagining yourself in the other person's position.
There's another phrase that I hear quite often. The one I'd go with is,
That's a nice expression when you're choosing between several options.
for example, if someone is deciding between 3 different language courses, you might say, "The one I'd go with is the second course because it includes more speaking practice."
That explanation is important. Strong recommendations become much more convincing when you explain your reasoning.
Nobody enjoys hearing, "Choose this one," without any explanation.
People want to understand why you're recommending something.
Let's look at one more situation. Imagine a friend is planning a vacation and asks for advice.
I might say, it depends on the kind of trip you want. If you're looking for relaxation, I'd recommend a quieter destination. If you're looking for adventure, I'd choose somewhere with lots of activities.
That's such a natural way to recommend something because you're adapting your answer to the person's needs.
And that's a skill that becomes useful far beyond English learning. It helps in friendships, work, travel, and everyday conversations.
The more we talk about this topic, the more I realize that recommendations are really about understanding people.
I feel the same way. The phrases matter, of course, but understanding the person matters even more.
And when you combine both things, good language and good understanding, your recommendations become much more effective.
We've covered a lot of useful language today, so before we finish, let's take a moment to review some of our favorite recommendation phrases and give our listeners one final challenge to try on their own.
Before we finish, let's quickly revisit a few recommendation phrases we used today. I'd recommend, you might enjoy, it's worth checking out, I'd highly recommend, you may want to consider, and if I were you.
And remember, the goal isn't to memorize dozens of expressions. The goal is to understand the person you're speaking to and choose language that feels natural and helpful.
Here's a small challenge for our listeners. Think of a movie, a book, a restaurant, or a place you'd recommend to a friend. Then try giving that recommendation using at least 2 of today's phrases.
Thanks for spending time with us today. We hope these expressions help you sound more natural and confident in English conversations. We'll see you again in the next episode.